Hey everyone in Gothic American literature, welcome to the last week of classes and a little break from tradition, being cooped up in my home office in my shed. I'm on my daily pretty much walk to my favorite park that's near our house, and it's one of my favorite places. It's beautiful at all times of day, and it's basically abandoned even when there's no quarantine on, so I love it. Anyway, so I thought I'd just do our first little video on Child of God from here. And I'm going to try to do, instead of, a 40-minute video, I'm going to try to do shorter ones on smaller topics, just because I think that works better, and so that you can watch the whole thing. Okay, so Cormac McCarthy. As I believe I mentioned in class, I think that, in my opinion, Cormac McCarthy is the greatest living writer, writing things in English, although he's 87, I think, now, and even though he has a long unpublished novel in the works, who knows if he'll finish it. But at any rate, he's still living, and I do think he's the greatest for a number of reasons. So just a little intro to him first, before we get into the book itself. So Cormac McCarthy, first thing we maybe ought to get into is his language. It's not the easiest all the time, and it changes book to book, as far as sometimes he's more minimalistic, and other times he uses tons and tons of words that you've never heard before. And the Child of God is somewhere in the middle, I would say. And even on the first page, you'll note probably words that, I don't know what that means, I don't know what that means. But, and that's similar to Faulkner, perhaps. He uses language in a very distinct way. But with McCarthy, I do want to assure you that not only does he obviously know what all the words mean, but it's not ever just a, putting on airs by using archaic words. He often uses words that are no longer used. But what does that do? It's showing you in a vivid form the change of language. All languages change all the time, and English is no exception. And so he's showing you and kind of making, so what it brings to mind for me is he's making of words and of the language almost like something more solid than just a story. He's forcing us to pay attention to the architecture by which he is going about telling his story, right? And so, out to the sun. And so it makes it, for me, it makes it a more substantial work of art. And it also, once you get used to it, and especially if you, are able to learn or know more of the words, and if you look up the ones you don't, it makes it a more vivid experience. And that brings us to the next part of McCarthy's style that you ought to be aware of. He takes after Hemingway, who came before him, in this way. He'll tell you less. He'll always tell you less. He'll always describe less, and then let your imagination be the thing that creates the world that you're seeing, okay? So instead of saying, well, then he walked here, then he walked here. For example, in the first chapter, you're getting the point of view of, first of all, the auctioneer in the crowd, and then you see the man in the bar, and you learn, that's the main character, right? Lester Ballard. But then we get the point of view of him, and it's not described, we don't get his name or anything. It's not like his thoughts or something like that. We see his actions, we see him looking out the crowd, and then the next thing you know, the auctioneer's talking again, and a man comes up behind him, and you have to piece together, oh, okay, no, this is the guy, and McCarthy gives us just enough hints. He's, again, ill-shaven, as he was called when we first, he was described in the barn. The point is that through this sort of minimal technique, McCarthy is making us imagine what's going on. As far as themes, McCarthy is so skillful at weaving what he's doing into the world of the story and the characters and everything, that it might not feel like, oh, there's a moral of the story, or there's themes or things like that, right? However, that's just his power as an artist, because there are. And there's not many people, but there's a kid bouncing a soccer ball, so I'm gonna move. Anyway, and so overall, you often see themes that come up in this book, in the rest of McCarthy's writing. What is the fundamental nature of human society? That's a big one. You might think, oh man, well, that sounds boring and like that's not relevant to me. But yeah, it is. Why, there's millions of people in our country, for example. And for the most part, we obey the laws. Why? Because we all have kind of agreed somehow that that's what we want to do. If for somehow, there's not like some force making us do that other than agreement. Sorry, it's windy. I'm going to go over here. And so what happens when their moral compass isn't aligned in the same way that we assume basically everybody's is? What do you do with that? And that's one of the main themes of this book. We're going around the corner to a spot where hopefully it's not as windy. There we go. And so, but another thing that's maybe more subtle and maybe isn't on our minds, and so we don't pick it up, but that McCarthy is interrogating the clash between nature, or whatever you want to call it, the natural world, or the way things would be, the clash between that and what we might call modern society. And not just modern society culturally, but economically. And we see that in the first chapter. So now, whoops, hang on, I dropped my notes out of my book. Oh man, this is an awkward video. I get it, it's okay. We're all in quarantine, doing what we can. Okay, so let's get into it. The book itself. For this first little video, besides the intro to McCarthy, I just want to look at the first chapter, very short. And I want to show you a few things. Of course, the intro to the book and the themes, but also how one could write a whole paper, your final paper, if that's what you choose to do, that's kind of a reading of a passage or something like that. You could easily do your whole 5-page paper on this first chapter. There's a ton going on. And as is often the case, the opening chapter is going to set the tone and give us the themes that are going to be present throughout the novel. So, without further ado, the first thing we see of Lester, right, is that beside the house that's described on the first page, off to the side, there's a barn. And of course, that's where the animals would have been kept and those sorts of things. It clearly designates domestic life or civilized society versus the barn. And it's put, after a lot of long sentences, that is put in a little short sentence so that we know it's important. Sorry, I'm gonna open my book. You're fine. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Yes, on the first page, beyond it stood a barn. And it's kind of ominous. And then we get on the second page, to watch these things issuing from the otherwise mute pastoral morning is a man at the barn door. That's where we meet Lester. I mean, this is written in the 60s or whatever, or 70s, I think, before probably there was such a curse on the name Lester. So if his name wasn't enough to give us a clue as to, his problems, we meet him standing at the barn door. So as opposed to with the crowd or as part of the group or in civilized society, he's outside. And that's one of the first things to keep in mind, is that think of who the community is excluding, and in this book and also in general. Who is the community excluding, and who is society making an outcast, whether actually or in effect. And then the first thing we see him do, and using the sort of minimalistic description that we talked about already, the first thing we see him do is pee in the barn, right? The man stands straddle-legged, has made in the dark hummus a darker pool wherein swirls a pale foam with bits of straw. Buttoning his jeans, he moves along the barn wall, himself fiddle-backed with light, a petty annoyance flickering across the wallward eye. he's, taking care of his business outside. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's a progression. For those of you who have, hopefully done the reading, we see him later. I think it says something like Lester shat. You don't get that past tense very often, right? And then he uses what to wipe himself? Now this is before, man, I didn't anticipate a quarantine joke. This is before quarantine. He uses a stick. I mean, come on. But the point is, he's in all sorts of ways characterized as being an outcast. But right before that, and this is the thesis of the book, right? We get the description, Saxon and Celtic bloods, a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps. And so that's the question the book's asking. How far are we willing to say that the dignity of humanity extends? When is it too much? And when do we say, no, this is no longer a human, treat him like an animal and kill him for what he's done? And McCarthy is not, a sort of sentimental downplayer of horrific acts of people. But he's proffering this thesis that, this is a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps, right? But not the main, but an interesting conflict that is difficult to maybe catch, especially amidst all the squalor and horror that goes on in this book, is how it all starts. How does it start? With an auctioneer trying to sell Lester's ancestral land, right? This was clearly his dad's land and farm. And for those of you who've read far enough along, what's one of the first things we see in the chapter? It's a noose hanging in the barn, where one assumes that's the same noose still hanging there that his dad hanged himself on, archaic past tense. And what's going on with the land? Well, it's being auctioned because Lester, one assumes, that he says the county took it, the auctioneer says. One assumes that Lester couldn't pay the property taxes because it's probably, it's paid for outright. This is their family home. But the only thing you still have to pay after that point is property taxes, which is a symbol of Lester and his family not being allowed to live just completely independent of society, but being imposed upon by the outside government and that kind of thing. And that's what precipitates the whole thing. And so you could say, and we'll end here, and hopefully this is a good way to view a lot of what's going on. You could say almost that for McCarthy, Lester Ballard serves as an illustration of the logical extension of this increasing modernization of society, where nobody is just an independent farmer. I have my own land. I don't want to, interact with people. I'm going to farm, feed myself. Well, no matter what now, there's nowhere on earth really you can go and do that. You are beholden to the state. And there's an inherent conflict between natural man, human beings as they might be in their natural state, or something like that. There's a natural conflict between that and modern society and government. But furthermore, you could almost make it like Lester is an image or a symbol of nature, or maybe something like that, that's crunched by this, because that's crunched by not only government, but by what's called late capitalism, namely shareholder-driven, interest-driven consumer capitalism. Why? Well, what's the point that the auctioneer keeps making? You can profit a ton off this land. Look at this. It goes across the road here. There's timber up in those hills. There is. Now, maybe it's been, milled or logged 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but it's still good. And every night while you're sleeping, it's just making you money. A piece of land like this, you can make 10, maybe 20%. And he gives a story of what? Of speculation, where his dad bought some land for $1,950 or whatever, and then sold it for $36,000. That's not appreciating the inherent value of something, right? That's treating everything as a commodity, something that, and an object, something that has a value based on what the market decides. Well, Lester Ballard, and here's where we'll end, Lester Ballard could be seen as a logical extension of that. But instead of stopping at trees and nature as being valuable only in as much as they provide something to the market or are commodities, he extends that principle to something that he wants that he can't have, namely the body of other people. And so he objectifies in the most dire way, objectifies the human body. And even though none of us will ever encounter or know anybody that's as fallen as a Lester Ballard, the question that the novel wants us to ask is, in what way are we much more subtly treating human bodies as commodities, treating, yes, a child of God, maybe one that's 12 years old working in a factory in China, making the t-shirts that we buy, how are we treating them as a commodity there only to be used to create value for us? Because that's exactly what Lester does, of course, in a horrific way. Okay, that's it for an intro. Sounds like it's raining, but I don't think it is. Next time you hear from me, I promise to be more civilized, but I thought I'd give this a try, and it's also thematically relevant to what we're talking about with Lester Ballard. Talk to you soon. Hope you're doing okay. Bye.